2 billion people around the world trace their beliefs, rituals, and calendars to the memory of one man. Yet, when you step into an archaeological exhibit or a museum of antiquities, there is no single agreed-upon bone, no inscribed statue, no signed portrait that reads, "This is Jesus of Nazareth." That absence is the starting point for a question that can sound like a provocation. Given Christianity's enormous historical footprint, why is the physical trace of its founder so thin? What are we actually allowed to say as historians about the man at the center of those 2 billion lives? I promise a clear, evidence-based walk through this problem. We will separate what archaeology can genuinely tell us from what it can't, examine the non-Christian testimonies from Greco-Roman and Jewish authors that scholars often lean on, and look at the Christian writings themselves, Paul's letters and the Gospels, to see what they contribute to a historical picture. Along the way, I'll explain the tools historians use to weigh competing claims, and I'll give a balanced verdict about what is historically plausible and what properly remains a matter of faith. If you enjoy careful historical deep dives and want the sources I mention, subscribe and check the bibliography linked in the description. I put together a short reading list and primary source references there. Start by framing an expectation that many people bring into this conversation. Archaeology equals proof. In popular imagination, a discovery like the bones of X or an inscription naming Y settles debates. That is rarely how it works for ordinary people who lived 2,000 years ago. The archaeological record is fundamentally skewed. Stone survives better than wood, public monuments outlast private homes, expensive tombs outlast simple burials. Even within burial practices, preservation is uneven. A poor man buried in a shallow grave is far less likely to survive the soil chemistry, later construction, and centuries of recycling than a rich tomb built with stone. Add to that the fact that many first-century Judean bodies were not left in single graves forever. Secondary burial practices, ossuary use in certain periods, and shifting funerary customs all complicate the trail. Imagine looking for the footprint of an obscure artisan in a city that has been rebuilt, razed, and rebuilt again for 2,000 years, with later generations mining older buildings for stone. That is often the best analogy historians use. For a low-status itinerant preacher from a backwater province, the expectation of finding a direct, unambiguous archaeological marker is low. That does not mean the man did not exist. It means we should calibrate our expectations about what material culture is likely to preserve. All of this is why when archaeologists do uncover something linked, however indirectly, to the world of early Christianity, that find gets intense attention. Two of the most discussed objects in this conversation are a stone inscription naming a Roman prefect and an ossuary, a limestone bone box bearing an inscription that some have read as referring to a James, brother of Jesus. Both have been fought over in courtrooms, academic journals, and public debates, but for very different reasons and with different levels of certainty. Let's look closely at each so you can see what they actually support. In the summer of 1961, during excavations at the Roman Administrative Center of Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean coast, workers uncovered a fragment of carved stone. When scholars reconstructed the letters, the inscription included a name and a title, Pontius Pilatus, prefect of Judea. The discovery mattered immediately, because until then, the name Pilate had circulated primarily in literary texts, principally in the Gospels, where he is the Roman official who presided over Jesus' trial and ordered his execution. Here in cold stone was an independent confirmation that a man named Pontius Pilatus held the official title associated with Jerusalem in the approximate period the Gospels describe. Archaeology had given us a small but clear anchor. A Roman governor by that name actually governed in that region. Why is this important? Because it corroborates one particular historical detail that multiple textual sources claim, that a Roman official with a title like Pilate's was responsible for dealing with provincial disturbances in Judea. The inscription does not and cannot prove any theological claim or narrate events. It does not say what Pilate did or did not do in any specific trial. But it does remove the possibility that the name Pilate was wholly invented centuries later by storytellers. It places the figure in the administrative reality of Roman rule. For historians, that kind of corroboration is valuable. It shows that at least some local administrative details in the texts are anchored in material reality. Even so, the Pilate stone is a whisper rather than a shout. Problems of survival again appear. The fragment tells us that a man named Pontius Pilatus existed and had authority. It does not tell us whether he met a man named Jesus, nor does it confirm the theological claims made later. The stone is an important contextual piece. It strengthens the plausibility of certain parts of the textual record. But it does not and cannot resolve the larger question: was Jesus a historical person? To answer that broader question, we must broaden the scope of evidence. This brings us to the ossuary controversy, a case that illustrates both the promise and the peril of using material finds to make historical claims. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, a limestone ossuary appeared on the market that carried an Aramaic inscription translating roughly as James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. If the inscription were ancient and authentic, it would be a striking direct link between an archaeological object and names that appear in the Christian textual tradition. James the Just, a leader in the Jerusalem community, identified as the brother of Jesus. The find, if genuine, could be read as material corroboration that a man named James, the brother of a man called Jesus, existed in that milieu. That initial excitement quickly ran into hard questions. First, the provenance. Credible archaeological claims typically come from well-documented excavations where the stratigraphy and find context can be checked. Items that surface on the antiquities market without secure excavation contexts raise red flags because, without controlled recovery, tampering, misattribution, and outright fabrication become real possibilities. The ossuary arrived in a marketplace that has long been plagued by illicit digging and forgery, and that alone complicated the initial assessment. Second, the inscription itself became the center of forensic and epigraphic scrutiny. Scholars examined the patina, the thin mineral crust that forms on buried stone over centuries, and the style of the lettering. Some argued that the patina and lettering patterns were consistent with an ancient inscription. Others pointed to anomalies and suggested modern incision or the application of chemicals to simulate age. Archaeometry, the scientific analysis of materials, was brought in, and the debate turned both scientific and legal. In some forums, the ossuary was declared by certain authorities to be a forgery. In others, including some scientific reports, parts were judged plausibly ancient or at least ambiguous. Third, even if we set the authenticity debate aside for a moment, the names themselves complicate inference. In first-century Judea, names like Joseph, Yosef, James, Yaakov, and Jesus, Yeshua, were common. Scholars who analyze name frequency in ossuaries and tomb lists note that combinations of these names are not unique. That statistical reality pushes us toward caution. A box inscribed James, son of Joseph, is not prima facie proof that we are looking at the brother of the Jesus familiar from the Christian texts. The context matters, including the find spot, the archaeological layer, and corroborating inscriptions or artifacts. Without secure context, the inscription's claim, even if authentic, is probabilistic rather than definitive. A courtroom acquittal or conviction depends on legal standards and evidence thresholds that differ from scholarly consensus, and scientific assessments evolve as new techniques are applied. The ossuary remains a contested piece. It might be an extraordinary link to an early Christian family. It might be a modern fabrication designed to play on the hopes of collectors and the headlines of a credulous press. The responsible historian holds both possibilities in view and emphasizes uncertainty. Stepping back from the pilot stone and the ossuary, what methodological lessons should we draw about archaeological evidence for historically obscure persons? First, direct artifacts explicitly naming a private individual from 2,000 years ago are exceptionally rare. Public inscriptions, administrative lists, and monumental texts are more likely to survive and therefore more likely to provide verifiable anchors for names and offices. Private items, personal tombs, household objects suffer from uneven recovery and intense pressure from looters and collectors. Second, scientific tools such as patina analysis, isotope testing, and microscopic examination of tool marks are powerful but not infallible. They work best when combined with secure archaeological context. Third, statistical reasoning about names and population helps put claims into perspective. A coincidence of names is more likely if those names were popular at the time. All of these cautions steer us away from rash headlines and toward probabilistic language: plausible, likely, possible, but not proven beyond a reasonable doubt. If archaeology gives us rare but meaningful fragments, the most abundant early evidence for the historical Jesus comes from texts, from contemporaries, near contemporaries, and later writers who refer to him or to communities shaped by him. The textual trail is thicker, but it comes with its own bouquet of problems. Texts are composed by people with intentions, by communities that remember selectively, and through manuscript traditions that introduce variations and sometimes interpolations. Because texts reproduce and reinterpret memory, historians of antiquity learn to weigh texts according to criteria that reward independence, early attestation, and plausibility in cultural context. A single late document that retells a mythic story is far less valuable for historical reconstruction than multiple independent witnesses that converge on the same detail. Before we move too quickly into those textual waters, it helps to hold in mind a distinction that often gets blurred in popular debate: the difference between historical existence and theological claims. A historian asks, did someone named Jesus live in first-century Judea and become associated with a movement that persisted after his death? A theologian asks, did that person perform miracles and rise from the dead? The two questions intersect in important ways for religious communities, but they are analytically separate. Historical methods, by their nature, cannot adjudicate supernatural claims. They can only say whether material and textual evidence make the existence of a particular human person and certain of his actions historically probable. One of the most powerful pieces of evidence historians use, and one we will return to in later segments, comes from letters written by an early convert, Paul of Tarsus. Paul's undisputed epistles, written in the 50s of the Common Era, are among the earliest literary witnesses to the movement that called itself followers of Christ. Paul writes as someone who believes he has met witnesses to certain events, refers to the crucifixion as a past event that mattered to communities he knew, and mentions names like James in ways that suggest real social relationships and contestations within early Jewish Christian networks. Those letters are not neutral historical reports, but they provide contemporaneous windows into how early followers interpreted their founder and how claims about his death shaped communal identity. But we are not there yet. I don't want to short-circuit the careful step-by-step case historians make from disparate pieces of indirect evidence to reasonable, calibrated conclusions. Archaeology has given us important context and a handful of potentially direct objects, but the weight of the case tends to rest on dense clusters of textual witnesses, some hostile, some indifferent, some faithful. In the next section, we will read what skeptical Roman bureaucrats, curious provincial governors, and Jewish historians wrote about the movement that grew out of Galilee and Judea. Those non-Christian testimonies are particularly important because they can corroborate elements of the narrative from outside the faith community, reducing the risk that we are merely reading pious invention back into history. Ask yourself as we move forward, when a Roman senator centuries later mentions Christus as having been executed by order of a procurator, what does that actually tell us about the earlier decades? When a provincial governor describes a sect that worshipped a crucified teacher, are they reporting their own observation or repeating hearsay from provincial archives? When a Jewish historian who wrote under Roman patronage mentions a few lines about a controversial figure, how do interpolation and textual transmission shape the wording we read today? These are the kinds of questions historians face, and they require careful parsing of language, chronology, and motive. But first, let's linger briefly on a broader methodological point illustrated by our archaeological discussion. Historical claims about individuals who leave few physical traces are often best supported by a mosaic of small, independent evidences rather than a single slam-dunk object. The pilot stone is a small but solid tile in that mosaic. The ossuary, if authentic, would be a direct tile with a contested fit. Texts, therefore, often carry greater weight precisely because they are multiply attested across different kinds of writers and contexts. Non-Christian accounts from Roman administrators, honorary letters from provincial elites, Jewish historians, and polemicists beyond the Jewish and Christian worlds each contribute different angles of corroboration or contestation. When those angles converge on a simple core proposition that a man named Jesus lived and was executed under Roman authority, and that his followers continued to claim he had unique significance, the probability of historicity increases even if no single strand is decisive on its own. That cumulative principle is important because it frames the shocking truth the title teases. The surprise is not that we have nothing. It is that the strongest case for a historical Jesus is built out of many modest, sometimes ambiguous pieces. Inscriptions, contested ossuaries, contemporary letters, later Roman histories, and Jewish writings, each imperfect on its own, but collectively suggestive. Human history, especially ancient history, frequently depends on convergent probabilities rather than a single irrefutable artifact. With that methodological map in hand, we are ready to shift from the ground to the page, to the testimony of classical writers who were neither Christian believers nor members of the early Jesus movement. The fact that voices outside the developing Christian tradition refer to a figure associated with crucifixion and a persistent following is particularly valuable because it reduces the chance that the movement invented its founder wholesale. But as we will see, independence, dating, and motive all influence how strongly these external testimonies can be used as confirmation. In the next part, we will examine, source by source, what Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Suetonius, Lucian, and other Greco-Roman writers actually say, when they say it, and how historians judge their reliability. Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Suetonius, these names might sound like classroom ornaments, but when we ask whether a first-century Galilean named Jesus walked the earth, their offhand remarks become crucial external checkpoints. We begin with Pliny the Younger, a Roman governor writing to Emperor Trajan around the opening decades of the 2nd century CE. Pliny is not trying to prove history. He is asking practical questions about how to handle local Christians who appear before him in trial. What matters for historians is what he reports about Christian practice. That Christians gathered to sing hymns to Christ as to a God, that they met regularly, and that their devotion was organized enough to appear as a social phenomenon in provincial life. Pliny's value lies in independence and date. His letter, around 110 CE, was written by a Roman magistrate acting in his official capacity. He neither belonged to the movement nor wrote to promote it. He confirms that, within a generation of Paul's letters, communities identifying with Christ existed across the empire and had distinctive worship patterns. Pliny does not supply biographical details about Jesus, and he does not claim to be an eyewitness to events in Judea decades earlier. What his testimony does is corroborate an early, geographically spreading movement centered on veneration of a figure called Christ. That is a piece of the puzzle. Independent, late 1st, early 2nd century confirmation that a distinct group existed and recognized someone called Christ as their center. A stronger, more specific external reference appears in Tacitus, the Roman historian who wrote the Annals under the Flavian and later Severan regimes, probably finished in the early 2nd century CE, c. 116 CE. Tacitus recounts Nero's blame of the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome, 64 CE, and, in doing so, mentions that Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus. This passage matters for several reasons. First, it ties the origin of the Christian movement to a founder figure called Christus. Second, it locates the execution under a Roman official identified as Pilate during Tiberius's reign, a correlation that aligns with the Pilate inscription we discussed earlier. Third, Tacitus is writing as a Roman elite, hostile in tone toward Christians. His mention is not apologetic or designed to bolster Christian claims. Historians debate Tacitus's sources. He likely wrote some decades after the events he summarizes, and it's plausible he drew on Roman administrative records, senatorial archives, or earlier historical compilations. That raises questions about how much Tacitus relied on independent documentation versus popular rumor. Nevertheless, his testimony functions as independent attestation from a Roman historian. He treats the execution as a historical fact and places it within Roman procedural language. That Tacitus, a critical Roman observer, records the crucifixion under Pilate adds considerable weight to the historical core that a man called Jesus was executed under Roman authority. Suetonius offers a more ambiguous testimony. In his Lives of the Caesars, early 2nd century CE, he writes that Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because of disturbances instigated by Chrestus. Scholars have long wrestled with the name. Chrestus, meaning useful or a common name, might be a misspelling or a reflection of a Roman misunderstanding of Christus. The passage does not narrate the life of Jesus. Rather, it describes unrest among Jewish communities in Rome, perhaps early conflicts between Jewish and Christian groups that Suetonius attributes to a figure or influence. The passage can be read minimally as evidence that disputes related to a Christ figure had reached Rome by Claudius's reign, mid-1st century CE. But its ambiguity and the possible confusion of names caution historians against overinterpreting Suetonius as a direct report about Jesus himself. Lucian of Samosata, a satirist writing in Greek in the 2nd century CE, offers another useful angle. Lucian's mocking account of Christians describes them as worshiping a crucified sage, and he ridicules their devotion to a crucified teacher who was crucified in Palestine. Lucian's irony implies that the idea of a crucified founder was, by his day, common enough to be the butt of satire. The value of Lucian's testimony is that it treats Christianity as a movement centered on a crucified teacher. Again, an external confirmation that the core claim of a crucified figure was not merely internal myth, but recognized by outsiders. Celsus, an anti-Christian polemicist of the late 2nd century, and other critics like him, assume a historical founder whom Christian writers claimed performed signs and attracted followers. Their opposition is useful because hostile sources have less motive to invent a founder that the Christians themselves had already produced. Instead, they argue against the movement's claims. That opponents treat Jesus as historical, whether to mock, refute, or reinterpret him, counts as indirect confirmation that a figure around whom the movement coalesced was part of common discourse. Taken together, these Greco-Roman witnesses do not give us an eyewitness biography. They were not present in Galilee in the 20s, 30s CE. They do not rehearse miracles or detailed sayings. What they do provide, and this is crucial, is independent attestation from non-Christian writers that a figure called Christ or Christus existed as the origin of a movement, that he was associated with crucifixion under Roman jurisdiction, and that by the later 1st and early 2nd centuries, the movement had spread widely enough to be noticed by provincial administrators and Roman elites. In historical method, multiple independent attestations to the same general fact increase the probability that a central event, a crucified leader around whom a sect formed, actually occurred. Turning to Jewish sources, the situation is both promising and complicated. The most famous Jewish reference to Jesus comes from Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote for a Roman audience near the end of the 1st century CE. Josephus mentions figures named Jesus in 2 places in his work Antiquities of the Jews. One reference occurs in Book 20, where he recounts the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Most scholars consider this shorter reference authentic, or at least minimally interpolated. Its style and placement fit Josephus's narrative, and its language, Jesus who is called the Messiah, suggests a non-Christian phrasing. This passage is significant because it corroborates the existence of a James identified as the brother of a Jesus who had acquired the epithet the Messiah, Christ. It aligns with Paul's references to James as a leader in Jerusalem and helps triangulate an early Christian family network. Josephus's other, more famous passage is the so-called Testimonium Flavianum in Book 18, a longer paragraph that explicitly praises Jesus and even states that he was the Messiah. Here, scholars are cautious because the surviving text in our manuscripts reads like Christian apologetic interpolation. The dominant scholarly approach is nuanced. Many propose that Josephus wrote a shorter, more neutral notice of Jesus, perhaps mentioning him as a wise man or a teacher who was crucified, and that later Christian copyists embellish the passage to read as a full endorsement. This partial authenticity hypothesis preserves Josephus's potential role as a non-Christian, early witness to Jesus while explaining why our current text reads as favorable to Christianity. The result? Josephus remains valuable, but historians treat the testimonium with care, extracting what seems plausible, a non-Christian mentioning of Jesus' existence and execution, and flagging the later, overtly Christian language as probable interpolation. Other Jewish traditions, such as certain Talmudic passages and the medieval Toledot Yeshu, are later and often polemical. The Talmud, a complex corpus of rabbinic writings compiled over centuries, contains scattered references that some scholars have seen as allusions to Jesus, but these are typically ambiguous, hostile, and composed much later than the events they might reference. The Toledot Yeshu is an explicitly polemical, often caricatural account that thrives in anti-Christian satire. Its utility for reconstructing early historical detail is minimal because it postdates the events by centuries and reshapes older memories through later debate. The careful historian, then, treats Jewish sources as providing both corroboration and caution. Josephus's shorter reference to James is strong corroborating material because of its approximate proximity in time and its non-Christian context. The testimonium probably contains a kernel of authentic notice that is overlaid with Christian additions. Talmudic and medieval Jewish materials are useful for understanding how Jews later reacted to Christian claims, but they cannot be treated as straightforward windows into first-century events. Now we turn to Christian textual evidence, the densest and most contested body of material. Here, the task is to separate layers, to identify which Christian documents are early and independent and which may reflect later theological development or community shaping. Pauline letters come first chronologically and are critical for the historical case. Several of Paul's epistles are widely agreed by scholars to be authentic and to date to the 50s CE. 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1-2 Corinthians, Romans, roughly mid-50s, Philippians, Philemon. These letters are not biographies. Paul rarely narrates a life history of Jesus or describes his miracles. Instead, Paul focuses on theological interpretation of Jesus' death and its significance for communities. For historical reconstruction, the relevant elements in Paul are striking precisely because of their indirectness. Paul treats Jesus as a recent, executed leader whose death and reported appearances shaped early belief. In a famous early tradition Paul transmits in 1 Corinthians 15, a passage that scholars commonly date to a pre-Pauline formula, Paul lists appearances of the risen Jesus to Cephas, to the 12, to more than 500 brothers at once, and then to Paul himself. Whether one interprets these appearances as visionary experiences, literal encounters, or theological claims, the historical fact remains. Within 2 decades of Jesus' death, there existed a tradition of post-mortem appearances that Paul did not invent but received and considered authoritative for early communities. Paul also mentions James, often understood as the leader of the Jerusalem community, and distinguishes between apostles who had seen the risen one and the ongoing influence of Jewish Christian leaders. In Galatians, Paul notes meeting Cephas and James and distinguishes his own apostolic authority from theirs. These incidental references carry historical weight because they show Paul dealing with people who claim first-hand or familial connections to the Jesus movement. They imply that Jesus' following included identifiable individuals, family members, local leaders, and that these relationships mattered to disputes about law and gospel in the 50s. Importantly, Paul's letters help establish a few firm points. A movement devoted to a crucified Jesus existed by the mid-1st century. That movement had recognized leaders and internal disputes, and traditions of early appearances and testimony circulated widely. Paul does not narrate Jesus' earthly ministry in detail, but he presupposes a recent, human, executed founder. For historians, the absence of detailed biographical data in Paul is itself significant. If Jesus were a mythic, purely celestial figure, one might expect mythic elaboration rather than references to local leaders and remembered disputes. Paul's social universe looks like the aftermath of an actual historical movement. The Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, come later and present the most detailed narrative accounts. Mark is generally dated to around 65 to 75 CE. Matthew and Luke to the 80s, and John to the 90s, though precise dating is debated and in some cases indefinito. These texts mix theological claims, narrative shaping, remembered sayings, and possible earlier written or oral traditions. They are not modern biographies in genre or method. They are theological narratives shaped for particular communities. Yet they preserve early traditions, sayings, parables, and story patterns that historians can analyze with the critical tools of source criticism and form criticism. One useful observation is the presence of multiple attestation. When independent strands, say Pauline letters, the hypothetical oral traditions, and multiple Gospels, converge on a particular event, that event gains historical plausibility. The crucifixion of Jesus is one such event. Paul references the crucifixion, all 4 Gospels narrate it, Tacitus and other non-Christian sources also refer to the execution under Pilate. That convergence across independent witnesses makes the crucifixion one of the most historically secure elements about Jesus' life. It is not certain in the sense of laboratory proof, but its probability is high. Other elements receive support from the criterion of embarrassment. This methodological rule suggests that details embarrassing or awkward for the early community, things they would not invent to glorify their leader, are likely to be authentic because invention would have favored more flattering accounts. Examples often cited include Jesus' crucifixion, a shameful Roman execution, the presence of female witnesses as the first to the empty tomb in some gospel accounts, in a culture that tended to discount women's testimony, and certain conflicts between Jesus and his family or fellow Jews. These potentially embarrassing features are not decisive proof, but they weigh in favor of historicity because they do not fit easily into an apologetic agenda that would prefer triumphant or unambiguously heroic beginnings. Form criticism and source criticism also help dissect the Gospels. Mark's narrative contains what many scholars identify as an earlier stratum of sayings, healings, and passion narrative. Matthew and Luke often appear to draw on Mark and on shared material, sometimes labeled Q, a hypothetical saying source, but they also preserve independent traditions. John reads more theologically and symbolically, but still reflects a tradition about a historical Jesus. The Gospels preserve different emphases, for instance, Mark's immediacy and suffering motif, Matthew's engagement with Jewish scripture, Luke's concern with social margins, and John's high Christology. But across those differences lie overlapping memories. A man from Galilee who taught, gathered followers, met conflict with authorities, and was executed under Roman authority. Beyond the canonical Gospels, early Christian literature supplies corroborating traces. Clement of Rome, late 1st century, writes letters that reflect an early community shaped by apostolic teaching. Ignatius of Antioch, early 2nd century, and Papias, early 2nd century, sometimes cited for his reference to sources, further attest to an early tradition anchored in people who claimed contact with Jesus' contemporaries. These writings show a rapid dissemination of traditions and organizational structures that presuppose an originating figure. A recurring question among historians is how to weigh legend formation and mythicizing processes against the possibility of a historical core. Memory studies and comparative anthropology teach us that communities quickly ritualize, interpret, and embellish foundational events. A miracle narrative, for instance, may reflect experiences that participants interpreted theologically rather than strictly empirical occurrences. That does not mean the initial person was non-existent. It does mean that historians reading miracle stories must separate the plausible socio-historical substrate, someone performed acts that attracted followers, from theological interpretation, claims of divine intervention. The degree to which theological claims reflect literal events versus community meaning is not always recoverable, and historians must often remain agnostic about supernatural claims while still treating the social facts as historically accessible. So what do historians actually conclude when they apply the full toolkit? Archaeology, non-Christian testimonies, Jewish notices, Pauline letters, gospel traditions, and methodological criteria. The consensus among many historians, including skeptics and non-believers as well as believers, tends to move toward a probabilistic but strong affirmation. It is highly probable that a historical Jesus of Nazareth lived in 1st century Palestine and was crucified under the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate. That conclusion is rooted in convergence. Non-Christian witnesses recognizing a crucified founder, Jewish mention of James as brother of Jesus, Paul's early testimony to an executed leader and to interactions with earlier witnesses, and the Gospel's consistent narrative across independent strands. Not every biographical detail in the Gospels is equally secure, and many sayings and miracle accounts cannot be demonstrated historically in the modern sense. But the basic structure, an itinerant Jewish teacher, associated with a following, meeting opposition, and executed by Roman authorities, enjoys considerable probability. It is important to highlight what historical methods cannot do. They do not adjudicate metaphysical or theological claims, such as whether a particular miracle occurred or whether the tomb was empty in a supernatural sense. These claims, by their nature, fall into philosophical and theological discourse about the metaphysical world. Historians can document that early followers reported extraordinary events, that various communities interpreted post-mortem experiences as appearances, that pilgrimage traditions and cultic practices developed quickly, and that religious claims had profound social consequences. What historians cannot do is convert testimonials of supernatural events into the same category of empirical proof we use for non-supernatural historical assertions. To put it bluntly, the resurrection is a claim about what may lie outside naturalistic explanation. History can tell you that people believed it, that their lives were changed by those beliefs, and that such beliefs left tangible social and textual traces. It cannot, by methodological design, provide an intersubjectively verifiable experiment to demonstrate the supernatural component. That careful boundary matters for anyone approaching the question earnestly. For believers, the historical verdict that a man named Jesus likely existed and was crucified can be a foundation for faith. For skeptics, the same verdict separates the human historical core from theological claims that require different kinds of assent. Neither side should confuse historical probability with metaphysical proof. The shocking truth in the title is rhetorical, provocative, but the substantive shock when you look honestly at the evidence comes not from denying Jesus' existence, but from recognizing how modest and fragile much of the direct material evidence actually is. The story of early Christianity is not supported by a single monumental archaeological find labeled with Jesus' name. It is a mosaic assembled from inscriptions that anchor dates and offices, from contested ossuaries that may or may not point to family links, from Roman and Jewish observers who mention a crucified founder, and from a rich internal textual tradition that records community memory, theology, and praxis. Let's return briefly to some of the key pieces and see what their combination yields when we weigh probabilities. The Pilate inscription anchors an administrative reality that the Gospels also presuppose. Tacitus and other Roman writers corroborate an execution under Roman jurisdiction. Their timing and critical tone make them useful. Josephus's shorter reference to James corroborates the existence of a Jesus around whom family members and community leaders formed. Paul's early letters, written within 2 decades of the crucifixion, presuppose concrete social relationships, named figures, and a recent executed leader. The Gospels amplify and interpret those memories into narrative form. Each piece has limitations, issues of interpolation, of later composition, of ambiguous provenance. But the fact that those limitations are diverse and independent is precisely why their combination is persuasive. Independent weaknesses do not collapse into a single point of failure. Rather, multiple weak indicators pointing in the same direction increase the probability that the underlying fact is real. We can illustrate this with an analogy to a modern historical investigation. Suppose we want to know whether a small political leader existed in a remote province a century ago and led a local movement. We might find a government register with the governor's name, letters from a central office referencing a suppression order, a local tombstone mentioning a family relation to the leader, and memoirs written by followers decades later. None of these alone proves every detail, and some might be tampered with. But together, they provide an interlocking web of corroboration that makes the leader's historicity highly likely. That is the mode in which historians approach the Jesus question. What about the controversial ossuary that surfaced with an inscription reading, in translation, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus? If authentic and securely provenanced, it would be a remarkable direct archaeological link to names in the textual tradition. As we discussed earlier, the ossuary's chain of custody, the patina tests, and the statistical commonality of those names complicate any confident claim. Historians must therefore treat that ossuary as ambiguous, potentially significant but not decisive on its own. It is the kind of find that could tip a probabilistic balance if accompanied by secure context and corroborating finds. Standing by itself, it is suggestive at best. Another common point of debate concerns the reliability of oral tradition in the decades between Jesus' life and the writing of the Gospels. Critics often ask, can memories transmitted orally over 40 or more years be trusted? Oral tradition in antiquity functioned differently from casual rumor. Communities with strong ritual and catechetical practices curated and repeated core sayings and events. Patterns of memorization and liturgical repetition anchored certain traditions. That does not mean every saying or detail remained unchanged, but it does mean that central elements, the Passion narrative, key parables, and certain sayings had institutional support that made their transmission plausible. Moreover, written intermediaries, such as earlier collections of sayings and Passion narratives, Mark being a candidate for using such materials, likely preserved earlier stages of tradition. The result is a mixed picture. Some fluidity around peripheries, greater stability at the core. Another common point of debate concerns the use of criteria like multiple attestation and embarrassment. These are heuristic tools, not iron laws. Multiple attestation strengthens probability when witnesses are reasonably independent. The criterion of embarrassment has to be applied judiciously, because what one culture finds embarrassing might not align perfectly with ancient sensibilities. Yet when multiple independent sources, Jewish historians, Roman chroniclers, Pauline letters, and the Gospel narratives converge on a crucifixion, the criterion functions well. Inventing a humiliating and shameful death for a founder would have been an odd rhetorical move for creating a victorious, triumphant movement. Therefore, crucifixion as a historical event is strongly supported. Let us now consider some common skeptical positions and assess them in light of the evidence. One skeptical thesis argues that Jesus was purely mythical, a celestial being later historicized. This view struggles to account for the social and political footprint Paul describes, family disputes, Jerusalem leaders like James, and the sociological development of local communities that claim contact with people who knew Jesus. Another skeptical line emphasizes later Christian interpolation and claims that early testimonies are so contaminated that reconstruction is impossible. While interpolation and contamination do exist, Josephus being a prime example, historians can, through textual criticism and comparison, isolate likely authentic cores from later additions. That process may be imperfect, but it is not arbitrary. Manuscripts, citations by early church fathers, and cross-textual comparison give scholars tools to reconstruct plausible stages of textual development. One honest conclusion is that absolute certainty is unattainable. History rarely offers the level of proof a courtroom or laboratory might demand. Rather, it offers a spectrum of probability informed by independent attestations, textual critical work, archaeological anchors, and socioeconomic plausibility. In that spectrum, the historicity of Jesus, the existence of a Galilean preacher executed by Roman authorities whose movement endured, lies toward high probability. The supernatural claims tied to that figure, the truth of particular miracles, or the ontological significance of resurrection, remain outside the historian's jurisdiction, and thus are appropriately left to theological and philosophical engagement. What are the practical implications of this balanced verdict for religious believers, skeptical investigators, and curious laypeople? For believers, the historical probability that Jesus existed and that his followers experienced something transformative in his aftermath provides a foundation to take faith seriously, while recognizing that religious claims require faith beyond what history can adjudicate. For skeptics, acknowledging the strong historical likelihood of a human Jesus does not necessitate believing supernatural claims. It simply recognizes the social and textual reality of an influential figure. For historians and students of religion, the lesson is methodological humility combined with rigorous skepticism. Be wary of sensational claims. Demand provenance for archaeological finds. Be transparent about probabilities and respect the boundary between what history can show and what faith asserts. Before we close, it helps to rehearse concretely what historians judge to be probable, probable but debated, and unlikely or unprovable. Probable. Existence of a historical person named Jesus, Yeshua, active in first-century Judea. That he was recognized by followers as a teacher or prophet. That he was executed by Roman authorities, likely crucified under Pontius Pilate. That a movement formed around his memory and teachings, producing communities documented in Paul's letters and later Gospels. That early leaders, such as James, played significant roles in the Jerusalem community and are attested in both Paul and Josephus. Probable but debated. Details vary. Specific sayings and parables attributed to Jesus. Some are plausibly authentic, e.g. aphoristic sayings that fit his social context, while others show signs of literary shaping. The precise chronology of Jesus' ministry, how long he preached, where he traveled, remains debated. Unprovable by historical method, matters of faith. The literal occurrence of supernatural interventions, miracles, virginal conception, bodily resurrection as metaphysical events. History can document claims and the social consequences of those claims, but cannot verify supernatural causation. To close the loop with the title we began with, The Shocking Truth Behind Jesus' Historical Evidence, the real surprise is not that historians find nothing. The real shock for many is the modesty and fragility of direct archaeological traces juxtaposed with the strong cumulative force of textual evidence. A cluster of ancient independent testimonies, both Christian and non-Christian, combined with early apostolic testimony and suggestive archaeological anchors like the Pilate inscription, point in the same direction: a historical person who became the nucleus of a movement that rapidly acquired wide geographic reach and deep social significance. If you came to this inquiry expecting an archaeological Rosetta Stone labeled explicitly with Jesus' name, you may leave disappointed. If you came hoping for a careful weighing of evidence and a sober answer to whether historians have reason to think a man named Jesus existed and was crucified, then the consensus you will encounter outside of public polemic is that the convergence of evidence is compelling. The conclusion is not dogmatic certainty, but a high probability grounded in independent attestation, contextual plausibility, and manuscript critical work. For those interested in digging deeper, I recommend consulting the primary ancient sources directly: Pliny the Younger's letters to Trajan, Tacitus's Annals, Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, Lucian's Satires, the pertinent passages in Josephus's Antiquities, the Pauline epistles, notably 1 Corinthians and Galatians, and the 4 canonical Gospels. For introductions to the scholarly debates and methodological tools, consult modern scholarly treatments that survey the historiography of early Christianity and the Jesus question, indefinite for specific modern titles. Primary sources and secondary introductions alike will allow you to follow the evidentiary paths for yourself and see how scholars extract probable narratives from fragmentary attestations. I'll leave you with one last consideration. History does not aim to diminish spiritual claims. It simply asks different questions. It asks how communities remembered events, how texts were shaped, how traditions formed, and what social consequences followed. For many believers, the historical affirmation that a man named Jesus lived and that something extraordinary seemed to have happened in the aftermath is a powerful complement to faith. For many skeptics, that historical kernel provides a fascinating example of how small movements can transform the world. For anyone in between, the balanced verdict is an invitation. Engage the evidence with curiosity, not ideology. Emphasize probability, not absolutism, and respect both the historian's limits and the believer's convictions. If this exploration raised questions for you about Tacitus's sources, about the Josephus passages, about how Paul's letters function as historical evidence, I'd like to hear which points you'd want unpacked further. In the description below, I've linked a bibliography of primary sources and a short reading list for further study. If you found this examination useful, share it with someone curious about history, and subscribe for deeper dives into these texts. Above all, keep the conversation civil and curious. The past rewards patient attention. Primary ancient sources cited or discussed: Pliny the Younger, Letters to Emperor Trajan, early 2nd century CE. Tacitus, Annals, early 2nd century CE. Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, early 2nd century CE. Lucian of Samosata, Various Satirical Works, 2nd century CE. Celsus, as cited in Origen's Contra Celsum, 2nd century polemicist. Flavius Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, late 1st century CE. Note the two references to Jesus/James and the interpolation debates regarding the Testimonium Flavianum. Talmudic literature and Toledat Yeshu, later Jewish traditions, polemical and not contemporaneous. Pauline epistles, authentic letters of Paul, mid-1st century CE, including 1 Corinthians and Galatians. The 4 canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, synoptic and Johannine traditions. Early Christian writings, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Papias, late 1st, early 2nd centuries. Suggested modern introductions and surveys of the debate, indefinito. See bibliography in the description for a curated reading list and direct links to primary texts and standard scholarly works. Thank you for following this careful, evidence-based walkthrough. If you'd like a separate episode focused entirely on one of these witnesses, Tacitus, Josephus, Paul, or the Pilate inscription, let me know which, and I'll take a deep dive into the textual details and the scholarly arguments surrounding that source.